Greetings, class. Welcome back to our discussion of World War II. This is going to be a little bit of a longer video. In this video, we're going to look at the European theater of the war from 1941 until the end of the war. So we've already looked at some of the European theater in the last video, but this will be from the point that the United States joins the war through its conclusion. In the European theater, don't forget, we also have the Pacific theater. All right, now let me say this before we get into it. World War II is the biggest war in history, and it's also the most written about topic in history. So obviously, we're not going to talk about every single fine detail of the war. Okay, a lot of people, and maybe some of you, are World War II historians, whether they, hobby historians, right? People are very interested in World War II. They like to read about it. They like to watch documentaries about it. All right, that's awesome. We're not knocking that. All right, I support any interest in history. I just want to make it very clear we're not going into the level of detail that some of those things may usually do in this course, right? As a survey course, we're going to keep it very limited. We're basically going to sort of look at a timeline of events and point out some key things that happen along the way, all right? So please don't look at this video as the comprehensive story of World War II in Europe, all right? It's far from that. All right, but where we're going to start with the Atlantic Charter. All right, now the Atlantic Charter is a meeting between Roosevelt and Churchill in August of 1941. All right, now if you've been paying attention, you should know that the United States doesn't join the war officially until December of 1941. So this is actually months ahead of the Pearl Harbor attack and the U.S. officially joining the war. So this could have been in the last video, but really this has a lot more to do with this video because what is discussed here is really Roosevelt and Churchill's plan for what the world will be like when the war is over. And ultimately, this is the beginning of what we know today as the United Nations. All right. So we're going to talk over and over again about what's going to happen after the war. While this war is still being fought, these leaders are discussing what's going to happen after the war. And the idea of some type of post-war organization that today we call the United Nations is sort of a key point in those discussions. So this is really sort of the beginning of that. All right. So you can see here some of the things they discuss in this Atlantic Charter. No territorial aggrandizement. That means we're not going to make empires out of this when the war is over. All right? We're not carving out bigger, colonial spheres or anything like that. Support for self-determination. So this is actually sort of the opposite. This is allowing the people of a nation to decide things for themselves. Restoration of self-government. That again is about decolonization. And so let me stop right here and mention this. So this is really, World War II is going to be the end of sort of the age of empires as we know it. A lot of these empires that we've studied, like the British Empire, the French Empire, they're going to end with World War II one way or another. All right, reductions in trade restrictions, better economic and social conditions for all, freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, abandonment of the use of force, and disarmament of aggressor nations. This should sound familiar because really what is being discussed here is everything that Woodrow Wilson wanted after World War I, up to and including the Organization of Nations, which in that case was the League of Nations, and here we'll eventually have the United Nations. All right, so when we're talking about World War II, and we talk about the allies, right? The allied powers. Really, there are three big ones. There's the big three, and no offense to the others, but this is really the three that matter. All right, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. These are the three that are really sort of running the show when it comes to the allied powers. Now there are others, all right. So for example, Free France, which we talked about in the last video, China, which we know is at war with Japan, and then a lot of other little small nations. So there's a lot, of nations in the world that are on the allied side, but there's really the big three who are sort of shaping policy and planning the war, and that's these three: the U.S., the U.K., and the USSR. All right, so a major point of contention between the allies is, how to proceed with the war, with the combat operations. All right, now remember that uh, Britain has, as of right now, only been attacked through the air, which they won that battle, the Battle of Britain. Uh, Meanwhile, the Soviet Union has been invaded. In the Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet people are dying. In fact, the Soviet Union is going to have the most casualties of the war. So, in terms of cost, all right, and people dying, the Soviet Union is really suffering. Okay, and so there's two things, and this isn't on the slide, so don't be looking at the slide. Kind of listen to what I'm saying here, and it'll make sense later. The Soviet Union is very interested in an allied invasion of Western Europe, all right, which we're going to call the Second Front. We'll see that later, the Second Front. All right, so imagine right now the Soviet Union is fighting the Germans in the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. That is where the war is, right? That's where war is taking place. And so what they want is Britain and the United States to invade Western Europe, in other words, France or the Netherlands, which would cause Germany to have to turn its attention to the West and then ultimately fight a war on two fronts. And, that would take some of the pressure off the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union is very interested in a second front. Britain, on the other hand, it believes that the first thing that is necessary is to secure North Africa. In fact, Britain has already launched operations in North Africa before the U.S. even gets involved in the war. Britain sees North Africa as important because, as we've discussed in previous videos, Britain is an island. Britain needs resources that it doesn't have domestically. Okay, so specifically, it needs oil. To have a modern navy, a modern air force, a modern army, Britain needs oil, and it doesn't have any oil. But its colonies in the Middle East do. So Britain has a lot of colonial interests in the Middle East. It has a lot of influence in the Middle East. It has established a lot of, puppet governments in the Middle East to ensure that it has access to oil. But the problem is now the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, control the Mediterranean, they control North Africa, they control Southern Europe. And so Britain can't really have access to that oil. The only way to get that oil to Britain is to sail all the way around the continent of Africa, which is, not good. So Britain wants to control North Africa to ensure that it has access to its materials. All right. And so the U.S. really has to decide, are we going to do what Russia wants to do or the Soviet Union? Are we going to do what the Soviets want to do and invade Western Europe and open the Second Front? Or are we going to do what Britain wants to do and go with North Africa first? And ultimately, that's the decision that is made, is to do Africa first. All right. So the first real involvement the U.S. is going to have in World War II in the European theater is the North African campaign. So here we see the British have already been fighting. We see, since 1940, Operation Compass. We have this large British operation in North Africa, and they've had some success. They've won some victories there. But then Operation Torch in November of 1942. This is an Allied invasion of North Africa that is the first to really involve a lot of U.S. troops. It's also the first large-scale airborne operation carried out by the U.S. So here you see a picture of these are American troops doing a beach landing, which they do, but they also drop paratroopers in, and this Operation Torch gives the Allies control of French North Africa. And so, French North Africa were French colonies. And then obviously we know that France fell. And so we have this Free French government in exile, and we have the Vichy French government in France. But basically with this, the French colonies in North Africa revert to, the true French government under Free France. This is going to cause Germany to go ahead and take over the rest of France. Remember, Germany had taken over a lot of France, but they had left that little part that was Vichy France. Germany is going to go ahead and take over the rest of France at this point. All right, the Battle of Tunisia. This is actually several battles, but this takes place from November of 42 all the way to May of 43. Another Allied victory here. This is the end of the North Africa campaign, and so now most of the Mediterranean is under Allied control. All right, so let's just look at this real quick. So May of 1943. All right, so imagine, the Soviet Union was invaded in June of 41. So the Soviet Union has basically been fighting in Europe now for 2 years without any relief. All right, and now, the North Africa campaign is ending. So, of course, what would the Soviet Union want to do? They would want the Allies to open the second front. All right, so let's look at sort of what's going on in Europe. All right, so what we're going to call the Eastern Front. This is where the Soviet Union and the Germans are fighting. We have the Battle of Moscow at the beginning of the war. Now, listen, I know that there are multiple ways to pronounce this city. Typically Russians call it Moskva. You can hear really smart people on TV call it Moscow. In England, they tend to call it Moscow. Most Americans refer to it as Moscow, so that's what we're going to call it here, just for the sake of understanding. All right, so the Battle of Moscow, this is at the beginning of the war. This is when Hitler invades. The Soviet Union is trying to take it over, and ultimately he is stopped. He is unable to take Moscow. So this is really Germany's first major defeat. Now, we said the Battle of Britain was one of Germany's first defeats, but that was an air battle. All right, this is a big battle. This battle involves lots of people. In fact, some people say this is the largest battle of the war. But mostly that's because all the Soviets are going to have to come together. I mean, they're defending their homeland. So here, for example, you see women digging trenches. All right, that's not something that you normally, especially in the 1940s, would have expected to see in a war. But in this case, it was a necessity. All right, so Germany's not going to be able to take Moscow. And some people see this as sort of the beginning of the end for Germany, at least in the Eastern Theater right here. But there's a few more battles we need to talk about. All right, so the Battle of Stalingrad is going to happen in July of 42 all the way to February of 43. This is in the city of Stalingrad, so we're going to have a lot of urban warfare here. Again, there'll be a lot of civilians involved. This is the bloodiest battle in history. All right, bloodiest battle in the history of the world as of right now. 2 to 3 million people killed. That's not counting all the casualties. This is a Soviet victory and is often considered the turning point in the European theater. And then the Battle of Kursk, following Stalingrad, that next summer. A lot of people say this is the largest battle in history based on the number of troops and military equipment, so like tanks and airplanes and things like that. This is another Soviet victory. So this ends the German offensive. This is the last German offensive in the East. And so from this point forward, from summer of 43, the Germans will now be on the defensive. The Soviet Union will actually be pushing the Germans back towards Germany. All right, so let's look at the date here, the timeline. We see that the North Africa campaign ended in May of 43, and now the Soviets are actually pushing the Germans in, the summer of 43. So the tide in Europe, at least on the Eastern Front, has already turned. All right, and the British and the Americans haven't really got involved in mainland Europe yet. All right, now, of course, the Soviets are still going to ask the other allies, Britain and the United States, to open the second front. However, Britain believes that the best course of action here is to now invade Italy. Again, Britain wants to secure its sea routes to the Middle East, and conquering North Africa or liberating North Africa, however you want to look at it, did a lot to help that. But we still have Italy, which pokes down into the Mediterranean, and of course Italy is under Axis control. And so Britain says, no, we need to move to Italy now, but that should pull some of Germany's attention at least away from the Soviets, all right? So rather than invading or opening the second front from, France, they are going to move some troops into Italy. All right, now, just to be clear, the Allies will win this Italian campaign, but it will actually go on for the rest of the war. So you see dates here, July of 43 to May of 45. The fighting in Italy will continue throughout the remainder of the war. This will result in Italy ceasing to be a fascist nation under a fascist regime, and Mussolini will be removed from power and ultimately killed by other Italians. All right, so Operation Husky in July of 43, this is the invasion of Sicily. All right, Sicily is an island in the Mediterranean. This gives the Allies control of the Mediterranean, so what Britain ultimately wants. It's also after this that Mussolini is actually removed from power. And then they follow this up, Operation Husky, they follow it up with an Allied invasion of Italy, which is actually 3 operations. There's 3 landing points in Italy. So Operations Baytown, Avalanche, and Slapstick, that's 3 different places where they invade. And of course, they are now in Italy and will be in Italy the rest of the war. Now, even though this is in Italy and Italy is an Axis power, all right, Mussolini is removed from power halfway through this. So he's removed from power in 43. Italy then sort of has a civil war going on. So there are people in Italy who are fighting on behalf of the Allies, people in Italy who are fighting, for this fascist regime. But for the most part, the enemy that the Allies are going to be fighting in Italy from this point forward will actually be Germans. So there are German forces in Italy, and this also removes some of the pressure off the Soviet Union. All right, now that fall, all right, fall of 43, there's going to be a meeting in Tehran, which is in Iran. All right, this is the first meeting of the Big Three. All right, who's the Big Three? Well, the US, the UK, and the USSR. So the leaders of those nations, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. All right, so they meet here in fall of 43, and they discuss some pretty important things. All right, for one, the Soviet Union agrees to help the U.S. fight Japan after Germany is defeated. All right, now I've made a point a couple of times, I've mentioned it several times at this point, that the Soviet Union is actually doing the majority of the fighting in Europe, all right, which is true. All right, not to take anything away from Great Britain or the United States, but the Soviet Union is doing the majority of the fighting in Europe. However, the Soviet Union is not fighting in the Pacific. The U.S. and Great Britain are. So the U.S. and Great Britain are, in their defense, they're actually fighting 2 wars at the same time. They're fighting a war with Japan, and they're fighting a war in Europe, or at least North Africa and Italy at this point. the Soviet Union has an agreement with Japan that they're going to stay out of it. And we're going to talk about that in the next video. Okay, so remember, we have two things happening at once. We're just looking at the European side right now. So there is another war going on in the world, all right, another theater of this war, the Pacific theater, that the Soviets are not involved in. But they agree that after Germany's defeated, they will help the U.S. fight Japan. Uh, so that's an interesting point here, and it's one that we're going to have to mention later because it leads to something really important. All right, Roosevelt promises to open the second front within 6 months. All right, so look where we are, November, December of 43. 6 months would be May, June 44. So he promises no matter where we are in this war, we will open the second front, which means an invasion of France within 6 months. Okay, just to spoil it for you, that does happen. All right, the U.S. will invade, the U.S. and Great Britain, the Allies will invade France in June of 44. So they're going to keep this promise. All right, even though, as I just mentioned, the war in Italy is not done. So the fighting in Italy will still be going, but we're going to go ahead and invade and open the second front as promised here. Okay, now they discuss the creation of an international organization. That's going to be the United Nations, as we've already talked about. They discuss the partition of Germany. So in other words, after the war, carving Germany up into pieces, which is going to happen, and we'll see that later. And the future of Eastern European politics. So a big question here is what happens to the nations that the Soviet Union liberates, such as Poland and Yugoslavia? Are these going to be communist countries? Are they going to not be communist countries? Are they going to be allowed to decide that for themselves? And we'll see how all that works out as well. All right, so Operation Overlord. This is the second front, the opening of the second front, or in other words, the Allied invasion of France. Now this begins on June 6, 1944, what we usually refer to as D-Day. Just a point there, when you hear the word D-Day, normally almost 99 times out of 100, when you hear D-Day, that means June 6, 1944. But D-Day just means the day that the operation begins. So technically D-Day can apply to any operation. However, this operation, which we normally associate with the term D-Day, is called Operation Overlord. All right, this is the Allied invasion of France, largest amphibious operation in history, and basically the Allies are going to now be in mainland Europe, in France, open the second front, and fight their way across Europe. All right, September of 44, we have Operation Market Garden. This was a big airborne operation coordinated between the U.S. and Great Britain. This battle, even though it was big, it is inconclusive. There's a lot of arguments among historians about who really won this battle. Basically, the Allies took every objective except the most important one, which was the bridge at Arnhem. They were unable to take that bridge, and so it sort of stalls. It gives Germany a little bit of resistance there in the Netherlands. And then in December of 44, we have the Battle of the Bulge. This was a German counteroffensive in the Argonne Forest, so in Belgium and Luxembourg. Basically, it's called the Battle of the Bulge. If you could picture a line, a vertical line across Europe, that would be the front, right? That where the Allied forces and the German forces are opposed to one another. Basically, this German counterattack puts a bulge in the line. But eventually the Allies are able to fight their way through it. And this is the last German offensive on the Western front. So we've already talked about the last German offensive on the Eastern front. Now we have the last German offensive on the Western front, which means if we were to look at Europe in the winter of 44-45, and we're looking at Europe, basically Germany is the meat on a sandwich, and the Soviet Union is a slice of bread, and the US and Great Britain and their allies are another slice of bread. And we're putting that bread together now to make the meat sandwich, which is Germany, right? So Germany's in the middle. It is retreating towards its own borders. It's retreating towards Germany. And the Soviet troops and the British and American troops are putting the squeeze on Germany from the east and from the west. All right, so February of 45, there's going to be another meeting of the Big Three. This is called the Yalta Conference. So this is in Ukraine. Um, they agree to some important stuff here that they've already talked about. They're going to talk about it some more. So they agree to the partition of Germany. They're going to carve Germany up, but also the city of Berlin, right? So not just Germany, but the city as well. Berlin will be carved up. They agree to the demilitarization and denazification of Germany. All right, so Germany won't be allowed to keep a military, and it won't be allowed to keep any of this. These Nazi leaders won't be allowed to remain in power. Um, and they're going to force Germany to an unconditional surrender, just so we're clear on that. They again discuss the future of Poland. Uh, because, just to clear that up, as the Soviet is liberating east to west, all right, as they're pushing the Germans back and pushing towards Germany, they're liberating Eastern Europe. And the Soviet Union is a communist country, right? Britain and America are anti-communist. So we're on the same side, but we're ideologically opposed to one another. And so as the Soviets are liberating, they're installing governments that are communist. All right, and so that's why this is a point of contention. All right, they again discuss the creations of the United Nations. The Soviet Union again agrees to help fight Japan once Germany is defeated, and they establish that the leaders of Germany and also Japan, to be honest, are going to be tried for war crimes. All right, interesting transition here because we just talked about war crimes. War crimes are something that really only the losing side is charged with because it's all about perspective. So, for example, that same month, February of 1945, in fact, just days after the Yalta Conference, British and American forces bomb the German city of Dresden. There's over 1,300 bombers, so we're talking about the planes that drop the bombs, over 1,300 aircraft that are just bombers. Not this isn't counting the fighters that are with them. They're going to drop over 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiary devices. Right, incendiary devices are bombs that are their purpose is to start fires. All right. And so you can see here the damage on this city is devastating. Over 25,000 people are killed. This is, I made that mention of talking about, war crimes and in transitioning to this. This is not for me personally, but for historians and people that study World War II. This is a contentious subject because is this justified? Is dropping bombs on a city and killing all of these people? Because bombs don't discriminate between men and women and children. I mean, they kill whoever. And so obviously a lot of civilians died in this. And so the question is this justified? And the Allies says, well, yes, it is justified because this city was important for communication lines, for transportation, and for industry. All right. In other words, this was important for Germany's war effort. All right. Now, I just want to take a point here and say that I want to make 2 points. All right. One, the United States has never shied away from this in its history. If you question that, look at what Sherman did to Georgia and look at what Sherman advocated for doing to the Indians, right? Uh, these types of campaigns were not unheard of in history, but obviously the tools have changed a little bit, right? Dropping bombs from the sky is a little different than setting cornfields on fire, all right? So obviously they're a little more costly in terms of human life, all right? The second point I want to make is bombing, this is what bombs are for. Bombs are there to destroy infrastructure, to destroy factories, to destroy bridges, to destroy important railways. Bombs are part of combat because they destroy infrastructure that the enemy needs to fight the war. All right, bombs are not there to kill enemy combatants. That's not really the purpose of bombs. All right, when we get to the Vietnam War, I'll talk about this again and that'll make a little bit more sense. All right, but using bombs to try to kill enemy soldiers, even though bombs do kill enemy soldiers, that's not really the effectiveness of bombs. The point of bombs is to destroy the infrastructure of an enemy nation. All right, so take that for what it is and we'll move on. All right, so in March, the invasion of Germany begins. Now it says here the Western Allied invasion of Germany, because what we're really looking at here is the British and American forces moving from the west. All right, so they're going to cross the Rhine River, all right, and fight their way across Germany to a point, all right. Once the Allies, and we're talking about the Western Allies, once they reach the Elbe River, they are stopped. All right, which is interesting. In other words, the Allies could have kept going, but they stop here at a strategic point to wait for the Russians. All right, you know, the idea is that the Soviets are our ally, and we're waiting for them to sort of meet in the middle. All right. Meanwhile, the Soviets are fighting really the last battle of the war, the Battle of Berlin, which they win. All right, so late April, we have what is known as Elbe Day. So the Elbe River, this is where American soldiers and Soviet soldiers begin to come in contact with one another, which means, all right, we go back to that bread analogy where the Allies are a slice of bread, you know, Britain and the United States are a slice of bread, and the Soviets are a slice of bread, and Germany's that meat sandwich. All right, well, if the bread is coming together, you know, that means it's over. The sandwich is complete. In fact, the meat's gone because you you just have the bread, right? So the fact that the U.S. and Soviet forces are meeting pretty much means the war is over. It means both sides have, you know, defeated Germany to that point. A few days later, Hitler commits suicide, and his subordinate is going to surrender to the Allies, and again, it will be an unconditional surrender. So this becomes known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day. All right, now one last thing to talk about. When we're talking about the European theater, this isn't part of the battles or anything, but we have to mention the Holocaust. All right, so the Holocaust is something that took place over the course of the war. And it was ultimately Germany's attempt to get rid of the Jews, right? So it was a genocide. They were trying to kill the Jews, which they did kill 6 million of them. Now, a lot of times these Jews, first they were rounded up and put in ghettos, and then eventually they were sent to concentration camps. And a lot of times they were, some of these camps were labor camps. So they were forced to work, and then some of the camps were extermination camps where they were killed. All right, and so over the course of the war, about 6 million Jews were killed. All right, which was about 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. All right, and then in addition to that, all right, we have 11 million others killed. So Jews are the biggest single demographic killed in the Holocaust. But then there's others killed that aren't Jews but are killed for other reasons. So a lot of Slavs are killed. People with disabilities are killed. This has to do with Germany's idea of eugenics. taking these people out of the gene pool. Prisoners of war, especially Russian prisoners of war, are killed, and then cultural outliers. So, for example, what we call the Roma people or gypsies, people that are like, homosexuals, people of other religious persuasions, and things like that. A lot of those people are killed as well. These camps do get liberated by the Allies. You see some people here. This is after they've been liberated. All right, so that is the story of the war in Europe. All right, but the war is not over because we haven't talked about the Pacific theater, which we will in the next video. And even when the war in Europe ends, the Pacific theater is still going. So even if we were alive in real time in 1945 and we had just witnessed VE Day, we would be very happy about that. But the war is not over because the war in the Pacific is still happening. All right, so we'll talk about that in the next video.